My name is Bethany, and I am 33 years old. I spent weeks meticulously planning a luxurious Hawaiian vacation for my entire family. But at our Thanksgiving dinner, my father looked me dead in the eye and announced that the trip was only for real family without me. My mother and siblings laughed right in my face. I did not cry or beg for their approval. I just nodded politely and walked out into the freezing rain. 3 days later, when my father tried to withdraw $5,000 for the resort deposit, I blocked his corporate card and sent a single text. Pay without me. Complete panic ensued, but they had no idea I was just getting started. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic relatives who took you for granted. Growing up in Boston, my family was obsessed with appearances. We lived in a sprawling historic estate that looked like it belonged in a magazine. My father, Richard, ran a luxury import business that afforded us a life of country clubs and designer clothes. Or at least that was the illusion they desperately maintained. I was always the odd one out. While my younger sister Chelsea spent her teenage years entering beauty pageants and climbing the social ladder, I was the quiet girl buried in math textbooks. I eventually became a forensic accountant, a profession my family found incredibly boring and entirely unglamorous. My mother Diane never missed an opportunity to point out my flaws. She would constantly compare me to Chelsea, who was 29, and the undisputed golden child of our household. Chelsea had recently become engaged to Cameron, a wealthy heir from a prominent local family. Ever since the engagement, my parents had been bending over backwards to impress Cameron and his parents. They bought new luxury cars, hosted lavish parties, and pretended our family possessed endless wealth. My older brother Jason, who was 30 years old and chronically unemployed, happily played along acting like a successful entrepreneur while secretly living off our parents. Thanksgiving dinner this year was supposed to be a joyous occasion. We were gathered around the massive mahogany dining table in my parents' formal dining room. The table was set with fine china crystal wine glasses and expensive silver flatware. The air smelled of roasted turkey and warm spices. I had spent the entire morning helping the caterers organize the food because my mother insisted everything had to be absolutely flawless. Cameron was not there that evening as he was visiting his own relatives, but his presence was heavily felt in every conversation. For the past month, I had been tasked with organizing a massive family vacation to a 5-star resort in Hawaii. My father had told me it was meant to be a grand celebration for Chelsea and Cameron before their wedding. I spent hours researching the best beachfront suites, booking private excursions, and securing reservations at exclusive restaurants. I even managed to negotiate a substantial group discount using my corporate connections. I thought this was finally my chance to bond with them, to prove my worth and be included in the family joy. As the caterers cleared the dinner plates and brought out dessert, I decided it was the perfect time to share the finalized itinerary. I pulled out my tablet, feeling a genuine sense of excitement. I had arranged everything perfectly. "I have great news, everyone," I said with a bright smile. The resort manager confirmed all our bookings for Hawaii. I managed to get the adjoining Ocean View Suites, and I booked that private catamaran tour Chelsea wanted. We just need to finalize the deposit by Monday. The lively chatter around the table suddenly died down. The silence that followed was thick and incredibly uncomfortable. My father, Richard, slowly set down his crystal wine glass. He picked up his silver fork and tapped it lightly against the rim, making a sharp ringing sound that demanded total attention. He looked at me from across the long table, his expression cool and condescending. "I think there has been a slight misunderstanding, Bethany," he began, his voice dripping with false patience. "We reviewed the room allocations yesterday, and we decided that we are going to need your suite for Cameron and his parents. The trip is really just for family now, so you will not be coming with us." I froze. My fingers gripped the edges of my tablet so tightly my knuckles turned white. The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. "Just for family." "What do you mean?" I asked, keeping my voice as steady as possible. "I booked the trip for all of us. I thought we were going together." Chelsea let out a loud, dramatic sigh and rolled her eyes. Oh, please, Bethany, do not make this a big deal. She leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. We really needed the extra space for Cameron and his family. They are used to a certain standard of luxury. Besides, you would just ruin the aesthetic of the whole trip with your cheap store-bought sweaters. Just like you ruined last year when we took those Christmas photos for the country club newsletter. You just do not fit in with that crowd. I looked at my mother, expecting her to intervene to say that Chelsea was being cruel. But Diane simply took a delicate sip of her wine and nodded in agreement. Your sister is entirely right, Bethany, she said, looking at me with a mixture of pity and annoyance. You have always been so socially awkward around wealthy people. You never know what to say, and it makes everyone uncomfortable. Let us be honest here. You are just the family bookkeeper. You do not really enjoy these extravagant trips anyway. Be a dear and stay behind to look after the dogs while we are gone. The absolute casually cruel nature of her words struck me like a physical blow. Just the family bookkeeper. Stay behind to look after the dogs. Jason, who had been quietly eating his pie, let out a sudden bark of laughter. Yeah, Bethany, he chuckled, wiping his mouth with a napkin. Someone needs to hold down the fort while the real adults go have fun. Try not to bore the dogs to death with your spreadsheets. The entire table erupted into laughter. My father chuckled deeply. My mother offered a refined, elegant laugh. Chelsea smirked, looking incredibly pleased with herself. They were laughing at me right to my face, in the home I grew up in. They saw me as nothing more than an ugly duckling, a useful servant who could organize their lives and balance their checkbooks but who was entirely unworthy of sharing in their happiness. In the past, a moment like this would have broken me. I would have cried, pleaded for their affection, or desperately tried to explain how much I wanted to be included. I would have internalized their rejection and believed that I was truly defective. But as I sat there listening to the sound of their cruel, mocking laughter echoing off the expensive wallpaper, something fundamental finally shifted inside my chest. The hurt evaporated entirely, replaced by a cold, crystal-clear realization. They had absolutely no idea what they had just done to their own perfect little lives. The drive back to my downtown apartment was a blur of sweeping windshield wipers and blurred streetlights. The freezing rain lashed against the glass of my sensible four-door sedan, a car my mother Diane frequently called an embarrassment to the family name. Usually, a drive home after a family dinner involved me gripping the steering wheel while fighting back tears of inadequacy. I would replay every conversation wondering what I could have done differently to make them love me, to make them see me as an equal instead of a servant. But tonight my hands were completely relaxed. The rhythmic sound of the rain felt cleansing, washing away the decades of desperation I had carried around like a heavy anchor. I pulled into the underground parking garage of my apartment building and turned off the engine. The sudden quiet of the concrete structure wrapped around me. I did not get out of the car right away. Instead, I reached into the passenger seat and pulled my work tablet from my leather briefcase. The screen illuminated the dark interior of the car, casting a pale blue glow over my face. I opened my encrypted financial application and typed in my master password. The loading icon spun for a brief second before granting me access to the true heart of my family existence. I was not just their bookkeeper. I was their lifeline, and they were completely oblivious to the depth of their dependence on me. 3 years ago, my father Richard called me into his study late on a Tuesday night. He was sweating profusely, pouring his fourth glass of scotch. His luxury import business was hours away from completely collapsing. He had spent years mismanaging funds, overstating assets, and skimming from corporate accounts to fund my mother and her extravagant lifestyle and my siblings' demands. The federal authorities were preparing to step in. A massive audit was looming, and the resulting federal indictment would have absolutely sent him to prison. He begged me to help him fix the books, to find a loophole, saving his reputation and freedom. I did more than find a loophole. I utilized every skill I had acquired as a forensic accountant. I took my own substantial savings from years of frugal living and smart investments, and I formed an anonymous holding company called CW Holdings, LLC. Through a series of complex but entirely legal financial maneuvers, I used the LLC to purchase the entirety of my father and his massive debt. I satisfied the most aggressive creditors and restructured the corporate accounts to comply with federal regulations, avoiding the impending audit. I effectively bought the family business. Richard signed over all the collateral to CW Holdings, including the corporate accounts, the luxury vehicles, and the Boston estate itself. To protect his fragile ego, I structured the paperwork so my name never appeared on the front-facing documents. I let him keep his title as Chief Executive Officer, while I assumed total legal and financial control behind the scenes. I saved them from absolute ruin and federal prison. I thought this grand gesture of silent sacrifice would finally earn me their respect. Instead, it only fueled their profound arrogance. Sitting in the cold silence of my car, I scrolled through the corporate transaction logs for the current month. The numbers painted a disgusting picture of entitlement and theft. I pulled up my older brother Jason and his expense reports. He was officially listed as a senior consultant, but he had not brought in a single client or worked a full week in years. I stared at a recurring weekly transfer of $3,000, classified under generic vendor payments. I knew exactly what those transfers were. I had tracked them back to illicit offshore gambling platforms months ago. I remembered walking into the office late one evening and catching Jason slipping hundreds of dollars from the petty cash safe to pay a local bookie. When I confronted him, he just shoved me out of the way and told me to balance it out like a good little calculator. Then I opened my sister Chelsea and her corporate card statement. The screen was flooded with exorbitant charges from designer boutiques, high-end salons, and luxury jewelers. All of these personal indulgences were fraudulently categorized as client entertainment and marketing expenses. I recalled how she had strutted into Thanksgiving dinner wearing a pair of boots that cost more than my monthly rent, a rent I paid entirely myself, while she lived rent-free in the family estate I technically owned. She had mocked my plain Target sweater, the very sweater I wore because I poured all my capital into keeping their sinking ship afloat. She believed she was inherently better than me simply because she spent the money I worked tirelessly to secure. Finally, I pulled up the lifestyle maintenance costs associated with my mother Diane. Her monthly country club membership fees, her weekly spa treatments, her extravagant home catering budgets, all of it was funneling straight through the corporate accounts, draining the reserves faster than I could manage. My mother, who had just sneered at me and told me to stay home and watch the dogs, was living a life of leisure, entirely funded by the daughter she publicly humiliated. I remembered a conversation from last Christmas when I gently suggested we cut back on the holiday catering budget. Diane had looked at me with utter disgust, telling me that my small-minded, practical nature was exactly why I would never find a wealthy husband like Chelsea had. She told me I lacked the vision and grace required for high society. She had no idea that her grace was currently being subsidized by my small-minded financial brilliance. I tapped the screen of my tablet, bringing up the master ledger that tied every single asset they enjoyed directly to CW Holdings. For 3 years, I had quietly absorbed their insults. I had justified my silence by telling myself that protecting the family name was the noble thing to do. I believed that shielding them from the consequences of their financial incompetence was an act of love. But looking at the numbers glaring back at me in the dark garage, I realized my protection had not saved them. It had only enabled their abuse. By removing the consequences of their actions, I had allowed their cruelty to grow unchecked. They believed they were untouchable by the law debt in me. They thought I was a pathetic woman desperate for approval, who would balance checkbooks while they lived like royalty. I took a deep breath, letting the cool air fill my lungs. The sadness weighing me down for 3 decades was gone. In its place was a calm, calculating determination. I was their salvation, but I could easily be their ultimate downfall. I closed the secure financial application and firmly locked my tablet. I stepped out of my car, my sensible shoes echoing against the concrete walls. As I walked toward the elevator, I felt lighter than I had in years. The invisible chains of familial obligation and desperate longing for their love had snapped. I had given them everything, and they threw it back in my face with cruel laughter. The time for my silent protection was finally over. It was finally time for them to face the harsh reality of the world they lived, in a world where I held all the keys. 3 days passed in complete silence after Thanksgiving. My family did not call to apologize, and I did not reach out to ask for an explanation. For the first time in years, I stopped trying to repair a relationship that only seemed to exist when they needed something from me. By early Monday morning, I was sitting at the granite island in my apartment with my laptop open and a cup of black coffee cooling beside it. The winter sun stretched across the hardwood floor, filling the kitchen with a calm, golden light that felt completely disconnected from the storm gathering inside my family. My phone had been vibrating for nearly an hour. The family group chat was filled with excited messages about Hawaii. They were discussing the vacation as though Thanksgiving had never happened, and as though excluding me from a trip I had organized was perfectly normal. Chelsea complained about the prices of the private beachfront cabanas. She insisted that they reserve the most exclusive VIP section because Cameron and his parents were accustomed to a higher standard of service. Diane immediately agreed. She added that the family should book daily spa treatments, private dining experiences, and a professional photographer to document the trip. Jason wanted to know whether the corporate account would cover premium bottle service and a deep-sea fishing charter. Then Richard joined the conversation. "Book whatever you want," he wrote. "The company is doing better than ever. We deserve this." I stared at his message for several seconds. Richard had not built anything in 3 years. He had not rescued the business from collapse. He had not paid the creditors, corrected the fraudulent records, or restored the company's legal standing. I had done all of that. Yet he still spoke as if the money flowing through the accounts belonged entirely to him. A moment later, a high-priority banking notification appeared on my screen. Automated withdrawal attempt, $5,000. Merchant Aloha Resort and Spa. I opened the secure banking application and reviewed the pending transaction. Richard was attempting to use the primary corporate card to pay the deposit on the luxury suites. The suites I had researched. The resort I had negotiated with. The vacation from which they had excluded me. The transaction was waiting for final authorization from the controlling account holder, me. I opened the administrative portal for CW Holdings, LLC, and entered my master credentials. The corporate dashboard appeared showing every account, credit line, vehicle lease, and financial instrument tied to the Winters family business. The $5,000 resort charge flashed in yellow. Pending authorization. My cursor rested over the red decline button. For years, I had protected them from consequences. Every time Richard overspent, I shifted funds. Every time Diane demanded more money, I found room in the budget. Every time Chelsea abused the corporate card, I quietly corrected the expense classifications before an auditor could notice. I had mistaken protection for love. In reality, I had only taught them that they could mistreat me without losing access to anything I provided. I clicked decline. The yellow notification immediately turned red. Transaction declined. Insufficient authorization. Then I opened the security controls for the entire financial portfolio. I disabled every physical corporate card. I suspended outgoing wire transfers. I blocked all secondary users from the company's available credit. Finally, I activated the cross-collateral default provision attached to the personal accounts Richard had pledged 3 years earlier. A green confirmation symbol appeared on the screen. Portfolio lockdown complete. The financial system that had supported their luxury lifestyle was now completely closed. They could no longer use the corporate account to reserve a Hawaiian resort. They could no longer use it to purchase designer clothing, pay country club fees, or finance Jason's gambling habit. Outside of the single accounts legally designated for payroll and essential operating expenses, they had no access to my money. I closed the banking portal and returned to the family group chat. Chelsea was still complaining about the booking agent. "Why is this taking so long?" she wrote. Tell them we expect compensation for the inconvenience. Diane responded with an angry message about incompetent hotel employees. Richard assured everyone that the deposit would be processed within minutes. I placed my fingers over the keyboard. I could have explained everything. I could have reminded them that I organized the vacation, financed the company, and legally owned the assets supporting their lifestyle. But explanations had never changed the way they treated me. So I typed only 3 words: pay without me. I sent the message. The read receipts appeared almost immediately. Read by Chelsea. Read by Diane. Read by Jason. Read by Richard. The conversation stopped. For several seconds, the group chat remained completely silent. Then Chelsea began typing. The typing bubble disappeared, and appeared again, but no message arrived. I imagined Richard standing somewhere with the resort representative on the phone, watching his supposedly unlimited corporate card fail in front of him. I imagined Diane asking what I meant. I imagined Chelsea realizing that the person she had called a useless bookkeeper controlled the money behind every luxury she enjoyed. I placed the phone face up on the counter and waited. 10 seconds later, it began vibrating violently against the granite. Richard's name flashed across the screen. He was calling immediately, exactly as I knew he would. For most of my life, seeing his name appear after I had disappointed him would have filled me with fear. I would have answered before the first ring ended, already apologizing. This time, I calmly lifted my coffee and took a slow sip. Then I watched the phone ring. I stared at the glowing screen of my phone as it vibrated against the cool granite countertop. The name Richard flashed in bright white letters. I did not pick it up immediately. I let it ring. I wanted him to wait. I wanted the panic to fester in his chest for just a few seconds longer. When the ringing was about to go to voicemail, I reached out and swiped the green button to accept the call. I did not raise the phone to my ear. I pressed the speaker button and set the device back down on the kitchen island. I picked up my mug of black coffee and took a slow, deliberate sip. "Bethany, what in the hell do you think you are doing?" My father's voice boomed from the small speaker. He was practically roaring. I could hear the echo of his voice bouncing off the high ceilings of his grand Boston estate. I could hear the sheer panic masking itself as authority. I did not answer him right away. I let the silence stretch over the digital connection. "Answer me right now!" Richard screamed. His voice was cracking with rage. "I am standing here on the phone with the resort booking agent, and my corporate card was just declined. You had one simple job, Bethany. You were supposed to manage the accounts and keep the balances clear. Unfreeze that card immediately, or I swear to God I will ruin you. I will have you fired by the end of the day. I will call every single firm in the city, and I will have you blacklisted from ever working as an accountant in this state again. Do you hear me? You are done." I listened to his breathing. It was heavy and ragged. He was completely out of control. For 33 years, that tone of voice would have sent me into an absolute panic. I would have scrambled to fix the problem, to apologize, to beg for his forgiveness so he would not be angry with me. But today, his threats sounded entirely hollow. They were the empty demands of a man who had not possessed any real power in years. I took another sip of my coffee. The warm liquid settled in my stomach. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the cool granite. "You cannot fire the owner, Richard." I spoke the words softly. My voice was calm and steady. It did not waver or shake. I did not sound angry. I sounded like a professional delivering a very mundane fact. There was a sharp pause on the other end of the line. The heavy breathing stopped for a fraction of a second. "What are you talking about?" His tone shifted from rage to genuine confusion. "What did you just say to me?" "I said you cannot fire the owner." I repeated the phrase, letting the reality of the words slowly sink into the conversation. "I am not your employee. I am your sole creditor." "Are you out of your mind?" Richard scoffed, but I could hear the slight tremor of uncertainty creeping into his voice. "I am the chief executive officer of this company. I built this business from the ground up. You are nothing but a glorified bookkeeper. Turn the cards back on right now before I call the police and have you arrested for corporate sabotage." I let out a soft, humorless laugh. It was a genuine reaction to his profound ignorance. "Do you remember that Tuesday night 3 years ago, Richard?" I asked, guiding him back to the moment his life almost ended. "Do you remember calling me into your study at 2 in the morning? You were sweating through your expensive dress shirt and pouring your fourth glass of scotch. You were terrified because the federal authorities were preparing to audit the company. You were millions of dollars in debt, and you were facing a massive federal indictment for financial mismanagement and fraud. Do you remember begging me to save you from going to prison?" I heard him swallow hard through the speaker. "That was handled," he muttered defensively. "We restructured the debt." "No, Richard, I restructured the debt." I corrected him. "I took my entire life savings and my investment portfolios, and I formed an anonymous holding company. I called it CW Holdings, LLC. I used that company to quietly purchase the entirety of your massive debt. I satisfied your most aggressive creditors, and I shielded you from the federal audit. I kept you out of a jail cell." He was silent. The gears in his mind were finally starting to turn. I continued painting the complete picture for him. "Do you remember the towering stack of legal paperwork I brought to your office the following week?" I asked. "I told you that we needed to transfer the debt to a private holding firm to keep the federal authorities off your back. You were so incredibly desperate to avoid prison that you did not even bother to read the fine print. You did not ask a single question about the documents. You just blindly signed every single signature line I pointed to. You never even asked what the letters CW stood for." "They stand for Clara Winters, my mother's maiden name. It was the perfect anonymous shield." "You signed over everything, Richard." I explained, my voice devoid of any emotion. "You transferred the absolute ownership of the corporate accounts, the luxury vehicles, and the Boston estate itself to CW Holdings. You put them all up as collateral against the debt. You kept your fancy title as Chief Executive Officer, but it was entirely ceremonial. I assumed total legal and financial control of the entire enterprise. I own the business. I own the cars you drive. I own the roof over your head." The silence on the line was absolute. I knew exactly what was happening on the other end. The realization was hitting him like a massive freight train. The heavy gold credit card he was trying to hand to the resort booking agent did not belong to him. The luxury estate he was standing in did not belong to him. He was a tenant in a life entirely subsidized by the daughter he had just mocked and excluded from a family vacation. "No," Richard whispered. The words sounded like it had been violently ripped from his throat. "No, that is a lie. That is completely illegal. You are lying to me." "I am an exceptionally good forensic accountant, Richard," I replied smoothly. "Everything I did was perfectly legal. Every contract you signed was drafted by a licensed corporate attorney and fully notarized. You voluntarily surrendered your assets to your primary creditor to avoid federal prosecution. I have spent the last 3 years quietly managing your debt while you and Diane and Chelsea and Jason treated me like garbage. I watched you squander my money on country club memberships and designer clothes while you laughed at my practical lifestyle. I protected you because I wanted to save our family. But you made it abundantly clear at dinner that I am not part of your family." "Bethany!" His voice was shaking wildly now. He was oscillating between sheer terror and stubborn denial. His massive ego simply could not process the fact that he was entirely powerless. He could not accept that the ugly duckling daughter had completely outsmarted him. "You listen to me," he growled. I did not answer the call. I tapped the red button on my screen, cutting off his pathetic demands. The kitchen fell completely silent. I knew Richard would not call back immediately. His pride was too severely wounded. He needed time to spin a narrative for my mother and sister, claiming this was a minor setback. Behind closed doors, he would be panicking. When cornered, my family always relied on their favorite blunt instrument, my older brother Jason. I knew Jason would be dispatched to my apartment to bully me into submission. I had perhaps an hour before he arrived. I walked into my home office, unlocked the bottom drawer of my filing cabinet, and pulled out a manila envelope. I had prepared this specific package weeks ago. I originally intended to use it as leverage to force Jason into a rehabilitation program for his severe gambling addiction. But after watching him sit at the Thanksgiving table laughing at my expense while actively stealing the money I worked to secure my desire to save him completely evaporated. I carried the envelope back to the living room and set it gently on the entryway console table. I checked the deadbolt and the heavy metal chain, ensuring the door was perfectly secure. Then I sat down on the sofa and waited. 45 minutes later, the peaceful silence of my apartment was shattered by a violent pounding. The heavy wooden door rattled loudly in its frame. The knocks were not rhythmic or polite. They were aggressive, furious strikes intended to provoke pure fear. "Bethany, open this door right now," Jason bellowed from the hallway. His voice was muffled through the thick wood, but his raw anger was unmistakable. "Open the door before I kick it off the hinges. You are acting completely insane." I remained seated on the sofa, my hands resting calmly in my lap. I let him pound his fists against the wood again. He rattled the brass doorknob, twisting it violently back and forth in a futile attempt to force his way inside. "I know you are in there hiding, Bethany," he shouted, his voice echoing down the empty corridor. "Dad told me exactly what you did to the corporate cards. You think this is some kind of funny game? You are messing with other people's lives. Unlock the accounts and give me the master passwords right now, or I swear you are going to regret it." He pounded on the door a third time, kicking the bottom panel with his heavy boots. The wood shuddered under the impact. In the past, this exact display of sudden physical aggression would have paralyzed me. Jason spent his entire life using his volatile temper to intimidate anyone who stood in his way. Our parents had always enabled his bad behavior, excusing his violent outbursts. He expected me to cower. He expected me to slowly open the door, trembling and desperate to pacify his rage. I slowly stood up from the sofa and walked toward the entryway. I stopped just a few inches from the door. I could hear his heavy, ragged breathing on the other side. He muttered a string of harsh profanities under his breath, kicking the doorframe one more time. "Bethany, I am losing my patience," he growled. "Hand over the banking access and stop throwing a pathetic tantrum just because you did not get to go on a vacation. Fix the cards, or I will break this door down and make you fix them." I did not raise my voice. I did not yell back. I simply reached over to the console table and picked up the thick manila envelope. I knelt down on the hardwood floor, bringing myself level with the small gap between the bottom of the door and the threshold. I pushed the envelope forward, sliding it smoothly through the narrow space. I heard the paper scrape against the hallway carpet on the other side. The furious pounding abruptly stopped. I heard the rustling of the heavy paper as he bent down and picked up the envelope from the floor. He tore the metal clasp completely open in his careless haste. I remained kneeling on the cold floor, listening intently to the sounds of his reaction. I heard the distinct sound of thick pages being pulled from the folder. I had arranged the documents meticulously. The very first page was a comprehensive summary report of his illicit financial activities over the past 8 months. The subsequent pages contained time-stamped bank statements from the corporate accounts. Following those were the audit trails tracing every single unauthorized transfer he had made. I included the precise digital footprints linking his generic vendor payments directly to an offshore gambling syndicate. It was a flawless, undeniable paper trail proving he systematically embezzled exactly $40,000 from CW Holdings. I waited a full minute, allowing his eyes to scan the highlighted figures and the damning evidence. The aggressive bravado that fueled his violent knocking completely evaporated. I could hear the sharp intake of his breath. The silence in the hallway was heavier and more profound than it had been before his arrival. I leaned my head against the cold wood of the door and spoke in a clear voice. "Take another step, Jason." My words cut through the wood, sharp and precise. "You can try to break down this door. You can try to intimidate me like you have done your entire life. But if you touch this door again, that entire envelope goes straight to the Federal Bureau of Investigation." I drafted the email to the Financial Crimes Division. "All I have to do is press send." I heard a faint choking sound from the other side. "You stole $40,000 from my company, Jason." I continued, my voice remaining flat. You embezzled corporate funds to pay off your illicit bookies. That is a federal offense. That carries a mandatory federal prison sentence. You are not a senior consultant. You are just a common thief, and I have the absolute proof of every single stolen dime. Bethany, he stammered. His voice was completely devoid of its previous malice. It sounded thin and reedy like a terrified child. You cannot do this. You are my sister. You made it abundantly clear on Thanksgiving that I am not your sister, I replied smoothly. You told me I was just the family bookkeeper. Well, the bookkeeper just audited your department, Jason. You have exactly 10 seconds to get out of my building before I make the call and have you arrested for felony embezzlement. I heard the frantic shuffling of papers. The heavy documents slipped from his trembling hands and scattered across the hallway floor. He let out a panicked, whimpering sound. The man who had been threatening to kick my door off its hinges just moments ago was now completely paralyzed by the reality of his own actions. I started my mental countdown out loud. 1, 2, 3. I heard the heavy thud of his boots against the carpet as he scrambled backward. He did not bother to pick up the scattered financial statements. He did not utter another threat. I heard him turn and sprint down the hallway. The frantic slapping of his shoes against the floor grew fainter as he ran toward the stairwell. The heavy metal fire door slammed loudly shut, echoing endlessly through the entire empty corridor. I stood up from the floor and brushed off my knees. The apartment was completely quiet once again. My heart was not racing, my hands were perfectly steady. I walked into the kitchen and poured myself a fresh cup of coffee. The first wave of their desperate attack had been neutralized. They had sent their enforcer to bully me, and he had run away in sheer terror. But I knew that this was only the beginning. Richard and Diane would soon realize that brute force would not work against me. They would try to leverage the one thing they thought I still cared about, the family image. I remained on the sofa watching the digital dashboard on my laptop screen with intense fascination. I knew my father would not simply accept defeat after his corporate card was declined. Richard was a man who believed that rules did not apply to him. I watched the live transaction log, waiting for his next desperate maneuver. I did not have to wait very long. 2 hours after Jason fled my apartment, the system alerted me to a new flurry of activity. Richard and Diane were attempting to bypass the frozen corporate accounts by switching to their personal credit cards. The transaction requests started pinging the network in rapid succession. First, there was an attempt to charge a personal platinum card for the $5,000 resort deposit. The system processed the request for a fraction of a second before flashing bright red. Declined. 10 minutes later, another attempt appeared. This time it was my mother trying to run her personal gold card for a $3,000 charge at a luxury travel agency. Declined. They were swiping cards they had not used in years, hoping to find a hidden reserve of funds. I sat back and watched the red decline notifications stack up on my screen. They fundamentally misunderstood the depth of the financial web I had woven around them 3 years ago. When I saved Richard from the federal indictment and established CW Holdings, I did not just absorb the corporate debt. I legally cross-collateralized every single financial instrument attached to their names. Their personal checking accounts, their individual credit lines, their investment portfolios, and even the equity in the Boston estate were all legally bound to the primary business ledger as security collateral. The mountain of dense legal paperwork Richard had so arrogantly signed without reading explicitly stated that any default or administrative freeze on the primary corporate account would instantly trigger a cascading freeze across all subordinate personal accounts. By locking down the LLC, I had automatically frozen every single cent they possessed. Their personal bank accounts were completely inaccessible. Their credit limits were reduced to zero. They were living in a multi-million-dollar mansion surrounded by luxury cars and designer clothes. But they were functionally penniless. They did not have enough liquid capital to buy a gallon of gas. The reality of their situation was finally setting in, and the resulting panic was palpable even through the digital screen. The family group chat remained completely silent, but my personal phone began to vibrate violently against the coffee table. It was not Richard calling this time. He was likely too busy screaming at bank tellers on customer service hotlines, trying to bully his way into accessing funds that he no longer controlled. The incoming messages were from my younger sister, Chelsea. The golden child was experiencing a complete and total meltdown. Her texts arrived in rapid succession, the notification chimes overlapping into a continuous frantic noise. I picked up the phone and opened her message thread. The tone of her texts was a chaotic mixture of sheer terror and blinding rage. She was losing her grip on the perfect high society life she thought she was entitled to. "Bethany, you need to fix this right now." Her first text read, "Dad just told me the personal accounts are blocked." "What did you do?" I watched the typing bubble appear and disappear as her panic escalated. "Answer me, Bethany." "The booking agent for the Hawaiian resort just called Cameron directly because our family card was declined 3 times. Do you have any idea how humiliating that is?" Cameron was standing right next to his father when he got the call. His parents are absolutely furious. I smiled at the image of Chelsea desperately trying to explain away the declined cards to her billionaire fiancé. She had spent the last 2 years cultivating an image of effortless generational wealth. She had convinced Cameron and his prestigious family that the Winters estate was built on an endless supply of old money. Now the illusion was shattering right in front of her future in-laws. "Cameron is asking questions I do not know how to answer." Chelsea typed her messages, arriving faster now. "His mother just made a passive-aggressive comment about our financial stability. They are threatening to call off the entire wedding if this Hawaiian trip falls through. They think we are frauds, Bethany. If you ruin my marriage to Cameron, I will never forgive you. Fix this bank error right now, you absolute psycho. Turn the cards back on and pay for the resort." I stared at the glowing screen, reading her demands. She was blaming me for destroying her wedding while simultaneously ordering me to fund her luxury vacation. Her arrogance was truly staggering. She still believed she could order me around like a disobedient servant. She thought her social crisis would compel me to surrender. I tapped the text entry box at the bottom of the screen. I did not justify my actions. I did not explain the legal mechanics of cross-collateralization. I did not express any sympathy for her ruined aesthetic. I typed a simple, direct response that severed the last remaining tie she thought she had to my wallet. Not my family. Not my problem. I hit send and immediately switched my phone to Do Not Disturb mode. I tossed the device onto the sofa and walked away. I spent the rest of the evening cooking a quiet dinner and reading a book. The silence in my apartment was profound and incredibly peaceful. I slept deeply that night, untroubled by the chaos I knew was consuming the Boston estate. The next morning, I woke up early feeling completely refreshed. The winter sun streamed through my bedroom windows, casting a bright, cheerful light across the room. I made my way to the kitchen and brewed a fresh pot of coffee. I finally picked up my phone to check the notifications. There were dozens of unread text messages from Chelsea filled with escalating threats and desperate pleas. There were several missed calls from Jason, who was clearly too terrified to come back to my apartment, but desperate enough to keep dialing my number. But there was only one notification that caught my full attention. It was a single voicemail from my mother, Diane. I leaned against the kitchen counter and pressed play on the audio message. Diane had always been the master manipulator of our family. While Richard used brute force and intimidation, my mother used emotional leverage and calculated guilt. I expected the voicemail to be a barrage of insults and commands. Instead, her voice filtered through the speaker, sounding surprisingly soft and remarkably sweet. "Bethany, sweetheart." Her tone was gentle, trembling with perfectly manufactured sorrow. "I am so sorry to bother you this early in the morning. I know tensions have been incredibly high since Thanksgiving, and things have gotten completely out of hand. Your father is just stressed about work, and your sister is panicking about the wedding. We have all been acting so foolishly." I took a slow sip of my coffee, listening to her masterful performance. She sounded like a loving mother heartbroken by a family rift. "I miss you, Bethany." Diane continued, her voice cracking with a delicate artificial sob. "I hate that we are fighting like this. You are my daughter, and I want to make things right. I want us to sit down and talk through everything face to face, just you and me. I made a reservation for the two of us at the Oak Ridge Country Club for lunch today at noon. Please come, sweetheart. Let us put all this ugliness behind us and reconcile. I love you." The voicemail clicked off, leaving the kitchen silent once again. I stared at the phone, a cold smile spreading across my face. It was a brilliantly executed performance. Anyone else would have heard the genuine pain of a mother wanting to heal her broken family. But I knew Diane better than anyone. I knew that she despised the Oak Ridge Country Club on Tuesdays because the dining room was always crowded. I knew that she only used that soft, gentle tone when she was preparing to spring a trap. She believed I was still the desperate, unloved daughter who would leap at the first sign of maternal affection. She thought a fancy lunch and a few fake tears would convince me to hand over the keys to my financial kingdom. She was entirely certain that she could manipulate me into submission. I knew exactly what the reconciliation lunch really was. It was an ambush. But instead of feeling anxious, I felt a surge of cold anticipation. I set my coffee mug down on the granite counter and walked toward my bedroom to get dressed. I was going to walk right into her trap, and I was going to bring the entire country club down around her. I walked into my expansive walk-in closet and bypassed the sensible, practical sweaters my family so openly despised. Today called for armor. I selected a sharp, tailored charcoal gray power suit I had custom-made months ago for corporate board meetings. I paired it with a crisp white silk blouse and sleek black heels that clicked with authority against the hardwood floor. I pulled my hair back into a severe, immaculate bun. I checked my reflection in the full-length mirror. I did not look like the timid family bookkeeper. I looked like a woman who owned a multi-million-dollar holding company. I picked up my heavy leather briefcase, secured the brass clasps, and headed out the door. The drive to the Oak Ridge Country Club was a masterclass in psychological preparation. I navigated through the winding, manicured roads of the affluent suburbs, letting the quiet hum of the car steady my breathing. The country club was a fortress of generational wealth and exclusionary social status. It was exactly the kind of place my mother worshipped. The sprawling white colonial clubhouse sat perfectly framed by rolling green golf courses and ancient weeping willows. I pulled up to the grand portico and handed my keys to the valet. He handed me a ticket without making eye contact, completely accustomed to serving people who felt entitled to his invisibility. I took a deep breath of the crisp winter air and walked through the heavy oak double doors. The lobby smelled heavily of fresh lilies, expensive lemon polish, and old money. The maitre d' greeted me with a practiced, polished smile and asked for my party name. I told him I was meeting Diane. He nodded sharply and led me through the main dining room. The space was filled with wealthy patrons, speaking in hushed, polite tones over plates of seared salmon and imported truffles. I spotted my mother immediately. She was seated at a prime corner table perfectly positioned near the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the 18th hole. She was wearing a flawless pearl necklace and a cashmere cardigan, smiling gently at the person seated across from her. I had expected her to bring Richard, or perhaps my brother Jason, as muscle, but as I drew closer, the profile of her lunch companion came into sharp focus. It was not a member of my immediate family. It was Cameron. Cameron was Chelsea and her extremely wealthy fiancé. He was the sole heir to a massive commercial real estate empire. He was handsome, impeccably dressed in a navy blazer, and possessed the kind of effortless confidence that only comes from a lifetime of absolute financial security. My mother had brought him to our private reconciliation lunch. The brilliance of her trap instantly materialized in my mind. Diane knew that I despised public confrontation. She knew that I had spent my entire life avoiding social embarrassment. She calculated that if she brought Cameron to the table, I would be far too intimidated by his presence and his immense social standing to cause a scene. She believed I would quietly submit to whatever demands she made, rather than risk humiliating myself and our family in front of the man who held the key to Chelsea and her high society future. It was a vicious, calculated manipulation. I did not slow my pace. I walked directly to the table and pulled out the third chair without waiting for the maitre d' to assist me. I placed my heavy leather briefcase deliberately on the pristine white tablecloth. The dull thud of the leather against the wood silenced my mother mid-sentence. Diane looked up, her eyes widening for a fraction of a second before her face melted into an expression of profound maternal tragedy. "Bethany, darling, you made it," Diane said, her voice dripping with artificial relief. She reached across the table and attempted to place her hand over mine. I smoothly pulled my hand back and rested it on top of my briefcase. I looked directly at Cameron. He looked tense and distinctly uncomfortable. His jaw was set tight, and he offered me a stiff, polite nod. "Hello, Bethany," Cameron said, his voice guarded. "Your mother thought it would be best if I joined you today. She explained that you have been going through a very difficult time lately." I turned my attention back to Diane. "Is that what you told him, Mother?" I asked, my voice perfectly even. "Did you tell him I was having a difficult time?" Diane immediately leaned forward, letting a single perfectly timed tear slip down her powdered cheek. She dabbed at it with a linen napkin. "Cameron, I am so sorry you have to see our family like this," Diane whispered, directing her performance entirely at him. "Bethany has always struggled with her mental health. We have tried for years to get her the psychological help she desperately needs, but recently she has become incredibly unstable and tragically vindictive. She has developed this terrible delusion that she is somehow in control of her father and his business." I sat back in my chair and observed her. She was weaving a masterpiece of gaslighting right in front of my eyes. She was attempting to paint my financial takeover as the erratic actions of a mentally ill woman. She was using my past struggles with anxiety, the very struggles they had caused, and mocked as a weapon to discredit my sanity. "We just want to help you, Bethany," Diane continued, turning her tear-filled eyes back to me. "We know you are lashing out because you are hurting. But freezing the corporate accounts and locking your father out of his own life and his work is not the answer. You are hurting the family. You are jeopardizing Chelsea and her beautiful wedding. Cameron has been kind enough to offer his family and their legal team to help sort out this mess you have created. We just need you to do the right thing today." Diane reached into her designer handbag and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents stapled together with a blue backing. She slid the papers across the white tablecloth, stopping just short of my briefcase. I glanced down at the bold black text on the first page. It was a total transfer of ownership agreement. It was a legally binding contract that would immediately dissolve CW Holdings, LLC, and transfer all assets, collateral, and financial control directly back to Richard. "Just sign the papers, sweetheart," Diane pleaded, her voice wavering with fake compassion. "Just sign the holding company over to your father so we can fix this terrible mistake. We can forget any of this ever happened. We can get you into a nice, quiet facility where you can rest and recover your mind. Do not force us to take this to court and expose your mental instability to the public. Do not embarrass yourself in front of Cameron and his wonderful family. Please just sign it and let us save you." She was expecting me to break. She was waiting for me to look at Cameron, feel the crushing weight of his wealthy judgment, and hurriedly sign my entire empire away just to escape the overwhelming social pressure. She thought I was still the fragile, broken girl who cried in her bedroom when they left me behind. She thought the threat of public embarrassment was still my ultimate weakness. She had no idea that I no longer cared about their high society rules. I did not care what the people in this dining room thought of me. I certainly did not care what Cameron or his billionaire parents thought of my social standing. I looked at the legal documents resting on the table. Then I looked at Cameron. I studied his face carefully. He was clearly distressed by the situation, but I could see a faint glimmer of confusion in his eyes. He was a shrewd businessman. He had undoubtedly noticed small inconsistencies in Chelsea and her stories about our family wealth. He was sitting here listening to my mother claim I was a delusional, mentally ill woman who had somehow magically managed to freeze a multi-million-dollar corporate account infrastructure. A truly smart man would realize that those two narratives fundamentally contradicted each other. You cannot be a raving lunatic and simultaneously orchestrate a flawless, hostile corporate takeover. I reached out and placed my hand flat against the stack of transfer documents Diane had provided. I did not pick up a pen. I did not look away from Cameron. The faint sounds of the country club clinking silverware and hushed conversations faded into the background. The trap had been sprung perfectly. My mother had brought the most important person in her golden child and her life to witness my ultimate humiliation. She had set the stage for a spectacular execution. But she had given the executioner and the axe directly to me. I moved the transfer agreement aside and opened the brass clasps of my briefcase. Diane's expression changed immediately. Until that moment, she had assumed I had arrived unprepared. She believed the threat of public humiliation and Cameron's presence would be enough to make me surrender. Instead, I removed a thick packet of notarized contracts, authenticated bank statements, debt purchase agreements, and corporate ownership records. I placed them directly in front of Cameron. "If I am mentally unstable," I said calmly, "then you should have no trouble proving that these documents are false." Diane leaned forward. "Cameron, you do not need to look at those," she said quickly. "Bethany has been creating these ridiculous papers for months. They are part of her delusion." Cameron did not answer her. He pulled the packet toward him and began reading. The first page showed the original debt acquisition. It documented how CW Holdings LLC had purchased the outstanding loans attached to Richard's company 3 years earlier. The second page contained the collateral agreement Richard had signed. The Boston estate corporate accounts, luxury vehicles investment portfolios, and personal credit lines had all been pledged against the debt. The third page identified me as the sole owner and managing member of CW Holdings. Cameron's posture slowly changed. He had entered the lunch believing he was helping a concerned mother manage an unstable daughter. But as he examined the documents, the polite discomfort disappeared from his face. In its place came the focused concentration of an experienced businessman reviewing evidence of a massive financial deception. He turned another page. This section showed the family's personal spending through the corporate accounts. Chelsea's designer clothing, her salon appointments, her jewelry purchases, the luxury entertainment charges she had falsely classified as marketing expenses. Cameron stopped at one particular entry and read it twice. It was the payment for a private engagement celebration Chelsea had told him her family financed from an independent trust. The money had actually come from my company. Diane reached across the table. "Cameron, sweetheart," she said, her voice trembling, "please understand that these records are being taken completely out of context. Richard used a temporary restructuring strategy. Wealthy families move assets between companies all the time." Cameron raised one hand without looking at her. Diane fell silent. He continued reading until he reached the property records confirming that the Winters estate had belonged to CW Holdings for 3 years. Then he placed the papers flat on the table. "Is the estate yours?" he asked Diane. She blinked rapidly. "The house has been in our family for years." "That was not my question." His voice remained quiet, but the controlled anger underneath it was unmistakable. "Does Richard legally own the estate?" Diane looked at me before answering. "There are complicated financial arrangements." Cameron's jaw tightened. "According to these documents, there is nothing complicated about it. Your husband defaulted on enormous debts. Bethany purchased those debts, saved the company, and became the legal owner of the collateral. Your family has been living in her property and spending her money while presenting yourselves as independently wealthy." Diane shook her head. "Bethany is jealous of Chelsea. She has always resented her. She created this situation because she cannot stand seeing her sister happy." Cameron turned to the pages documenting Chelsea's spending. "Did Chelsea know about this?" "Of course not." Diane answered too quickly. "Chelsea has nothing to do with the business. She told me she had a multi-million-dollar trust fund." Diane's mouth opened, but no words came out. "She told my parents that the Boston estate had been owned by your family for 5 generations. She said you planned to transfer the property to us after the wedding." Cameron pushed the paper slightly toward Diane. "Were those statements true?" Diane's carefully controlled expression began to fracture. "We were trying to protect Chelsea from Richard's temporary business difficulties. She loves you. We did not want a minor financial issue to destroy her future." This is not a minor financial issue, Cameron said. He looked directly at me. Did you legally authorize any of the claims Chelsea made about the estate or the trust fund? No, I answered. There is no trust fund. There was never any plan to transfer the estate. The property is collateral belonging to CW Holdings. Cameron leaned back in his chair. For several seconds, he said nothing. Around us, the country club dining room continued operating normally. Silverware touched porcelain. Waiters moved between tables. Patrons spoke in quiet voices. But the social world my mother had spent decades constructing was collapsing at our table. Finally, Cameron turned to Diane. My parents are already in Hawaii, he said. They arrived early because your family insisted this trip would be an important pre-wedding gathering. Diane immediately seized on the statement. Exactly. This is why we must put this ugly misunderstanding behind us. Once everyone is together, we can Cameron cut her off. There is no misunderstanding. He gathered the documents and returned them to the center of the table. I am flying to Hawaii tonight. Chelsea and the rest of your family can explain these records in front of my parents. Until every financial claim you made has been independently verified, all wedding plans are suspended. Diane's face went pale. Cameron, please do not do this. Think about how devastated Chelsea will be. I am thinking about my family, he replied. Your daughter looked my parents in the eye and made claims that appear to be completely false. You brought me here to help pressure Bethany into surrendering assets that legally belong to her. Then you tried to discredit her by calling her mentally ill. He stood up from the table. If these records are authentic, this is not merely embarrassing. It is calculated fraud. Diane grabbed the sleeve of his navy blazer. Chelsea loves you. Everything we did was to give her the future she deserves. Cameron pulled his arm away. The future she deserves will be determined by the truth, not by whatever image you manufactured for her. He looked at me and gave a brief, respectful nod. Thank you for showing me the documents. Then he turned back to Diane. Do not contact my parents before you arrive in Hawaii. Do not invent another explanation. I want Richard and Chelsea to answer my questions directly. He walked away from the table and disappeared through the heavy oak doors. Diane remained frozen for several seconds. Then the shock gave way to fury. She turned toward me, her face twisted with rage. You have ruined everything, she whispered. You have destroyed your sister's future. No, mother, I replied. The lies destroyed it. I only brought the records. I stood up from the table, leaving my mother to her hysterical sobbing. I did not offer her a single word of comfort. I simply picked up my heavy leather briefcase and walked out of the Oak Ridge Country Club. The valet brought my sensible sedan around, and I drove back to my downtown office. The war had officially escalated to the legal battlefield. Humiliated and completely desperate, Richard did exactly what I anticipated he would do when backed into a corner. He hired a sleazy, aggressive lawyer to file a fraudulent emergency court injunction against me. Less than 48 hours later, a process server cornered me outside my building and shoved a thick stack of papers into my hands. I looked at the court summons and smiled. I pulled out my phone and made a call to a ruthless, undefeated corporate attorney I befriended years ago named Harrison. It is time to let them think they are winning, I told him. I ended the call and slipped my phone back into my pocket. The winter air bit at my cheeks as I walked the remaining 2 blocks to the imposing glass and steel skyscraper that housed Harrison and his elite legal team. Harrison was a shark in a tailored suit. We had met 5 years ago during a particularly grueling corporate audit where we both found ourselves on the same side of a hostile merger. I provided the undeniable financial forensics, and he provided the ruthless legal execution. We had been quietly collaborating ever since. He was the only person in Boston who knew the absolute truth about my family and the vast financial empire I had built beneath their feet. I rode the private elevator up to the 50th floor. The doors opened with a soft chime revealing a sleek, minimalist reception area. The receptionist recognized me immediately and gave a respectful nod, bypassing the usual security protocols. She gestured toward the long corridor of executive suites. I walked down the hall, my heels clicking against the polished marble floor, until I reached the massive glass-walled conference room at the very end. Harrison was already inside. He was standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows looking out over the sprawling Boston skyline. The conference table was covered in thick stacks of legal documents, all neatly organized and bristling with aggressive yellow sticky notes. He turned around as I pushed the heavy glass door open. He did not offer a warm greeting or polite small talk. He simply picked up the top file from the table and held it out toward me. "Your father is a special kind of stupid, Bethany," Harrison said, his voice carrying that familiar razor-sharp edge. "He filed an emergency court injunction this morning claiming you used coercion and elder abuse to trick him into signing away his company 3 years ago. His lawyer is a bottom-feeding ambulance chaser who thinks he can freeze your assets by throwing enough mud at the wall to see what sticks." I walked over to the table and took the document from his hand. I scanned the ridiculous allegations. Richard was actually claiming that he was medically incapacitated at the time of the transfer, and that I had maliciously withheld his medication until he signed the papers. The sheer audacity of the lie was almost impressive. "Do not worry about this garbage," Harrison continued, pacing the length of the conference table. "I already have the counter motions drafted. We have the original notarized documents. We have the video recordings from the closing where he happily signed everything while bragging about his business acumen. I even pulled the medical records proving he was in perfect health. We can walk into the courthouse in an hour and absolutely crush this injunction. The judge will throw it out before lunch, and we can have his lawyer sanctioned for filing a frivolous lawsuit. I can have your father facing perjury charges by the end of the day." Harrison was practically vibrating with aggressive energy. He thrived on destroying arrogant men in the courtroom. He reached for his briefcase, ready to pack the evidence and head straight to the courthouse. He was fully prepared to unleash a legal bloodbath to protect my assets. I reached out and placed my hand firmly over the stack of countermotions. I pressed down, stopping him from picking them up. "Do not file the countermotions, Harrison," I said quietly. Harrison froze. He looked at my hand resting on his meticulously prepared legal defense and then looked up at my face. His brow furrowed in deep confusion. "Bethany, what are you talking about? We have to file these right now. If we let this injunction sit, the court might temporarily freeze your secondary operational accounts. We have the absolute proof to destroy him. Why on earth would we wait?" "Because I do not want to fight it yet," I replied, holding his gaze steadily. "I want you to let the injunction go through." Harrison let out a sharp breath of disbelief. He ran a hand through his dark hair, clearly struggling to comprehend my logic. He hated losing even temporarily. "Bethany, you are paying me an exorbitant amount of money to protect your holding company. Letting your father win a fraudulent injunction goes against every single legal instinct I have. He is trying to paint you as an abusive criminal. You cannot just sit back and let him control the narrative." "He is not controlling anything," I said, withdrawing my hand from the documents. I walked over to the window and looked down at the tiny cars navigating the busy city streets far below us. "Harrison, you are a brilliant lawyer, but you do not understand the profound depths of my family and their arrogance. If we march into court today and crush this injunction, Richard will panic. He will realize that his cheap legal tricks will not work against me. A cornered animal is incredibly dangerous. If he panics, he will stay right here in Boston. He will dig his heels in and fight dirty. He will lock himself inside the estate and make a massive public scene. I do not want a messy, prolonged standoff at my front door." I turned back to face him. "I want to play a much different game." Harrison crossed his arms over his chest, leaning against the edge of the conference table. "I am listening." He said, his tone cautious but intrigued. "My family operates entirely on ego and the illusion of superiority," I explained, walking slowly back toward the center of the room. "Right now, Richard thinks he has cornered me. He thinks the sleazy lawyer has successfully outmaneuvered the quiet bookkeeper daughter. We need to give them exactly enough rope to hang themselves. We are going to let them believe that the injunction worked perfectly. We are going to let them think they have successfully paralyzed me and regained the upper hand. Harrison narrowed his eyes, processing the strategy. If they think they are winning, their arrogance will completely blind them to the real danger. Exactly. I smiled, feeling a cold sense of satisfaction settling in my chest. Right now, my family is scheduled to fly to Hawaii. Cameron and his parents are already on the island, waiting for Chelsea and my parents to explain the financial records I showed him. Chelsea believes this trip is her final chance to save the wedding by proving that her family is still wealthy. They need to get on that plane to Hawaii. I walked back to the massive oak conference table and picked up my laptop from my briefcase. I opened the screen and let it wake up. Harrison watched me closely, his sharp eyes tracking my every movement. I navigated back to the secure administrative banking portal for my holding company. The system loaded, displaying the total freeze I had initiated earlier. I need them to believe that their cheap, aggressive legal maneuver actually worked. I need Richard to think that he successfully intimidated me into submission. If he believes he has won, he will let his guard down completely. His arrogance will blind him to the reality of his situation. I pulled up the pending ledger for the primary corporate account. I looked at the flight costs and the required deposit for the luxury suites at the Aloha Resort and Spa. I did some quick mental math. The total came to exactly $25,000. I moved my cursor over the security settings. I bypassed the total lockdown protocol just for a fraction of a second. I created a temporary, highly restricted window of access. I authorized a single one-time release of exactly $25,000. No more and no less. Just enough to cover the first-class tickets and the hotel deposit. Harrison stepped forward, placing his hands flat on the table. He stared at the screen as the authorization went through. The red flashing alerts on the dashboard turned to a calm, compliant green for that specific amount. Bethany, what exactly are you doing? He asked, his voice a mixture of professional concern and genuine disbelief. You just gave them $25,000 of your own money. They just tried to paint you as an abusive criminal in a court of law. They tried to steal your company back. Why on earth are you funding their luxury vacation right now? You are giving them exactly what they want. I am giving them exactly enough rope to hang themselves, I replied, pushing the laptop away. I looked up at Harrison, keeping my gaze steady and cold. Think about how my father operates, Harrison. If we fight this injunction today and win, he will realize he has no legal recourse left. He will panic. He will drive straight back to the Boston estate, lock the heavy iron gates, and refuse to leave. He will barricade himself inside my property and force us to execute a highly publicized, messy eviction. He will call the local news stations and drag my name through the mud, claiming I am throwing my elderly parents out onto the street. I will not give him the satisfaction of a public standoff on my front lawn. I took a deep breath, letting the strategy fully materialize in the room between us. But if I release this money, he will instantly assume his sleazy lawyer terrified me. He will think the court injunction forced my hand and made me unlock the corporate accounts. His massive ego will readily accept that narrative because it aligns perfectly with his worldview. He will feel victorious. He will pack his designer luggage, and he will take Diane, Chelsea, and Jason to the airport. They will board a first-class flight to Hawaii, completely convinced that they have successfully put the quiet bookkeeper daughter back in her proper place. Harrison slowly stood up straight. A small, appreciative smile began to form at the corners of his mouth. The aggressive corporate shark was finally seeing the blood in the water. You want them out of the state, he murmured, nodding slowly as the pieces clicked together in his brilliant legal mind. I want them off the entire continent, I corrected him. Hawaii is 5,000 miles away from Boston. Once they board that plane, they will be trapped in a metal tube over the Pacific Ocean for 10 hours. They will have absolutely no cell service and no wireless internet. They will be entirely disconnected from the mainland. And while they are soaring through the clouds, sipping complimentary champagne and toasting to their fraudulent victory, we are going to drive over to the Boston estate. We are going to meet the locksmith and the real estate agent at the front door. We are going to legally foreclose on the property, change every single lock and chain the gates shut. They will not be physically present to interfere, to cause a scene, or to beg for mercy. They will land in a tropical paradise, completely oblivious to the fact that they no longer have a home to return to. I watched Harrison process the sheer magnitude of the plan. He walked back over to the floor-to-ceiling windows looking out at the city below. The afternoon sun was beginning to set, casting a brilliant golden glow across the glass skyscrapers of the financial district. He remained silent for a long moment, letting the brilliant cruelty of the strategy settle over him. I knew he appreciated the flawless execution of a corporate takeover, but this was far more personal than a standard business transaction. This was about dismantling a toxic family dynamic that had suffocated me for over 3 decades. "Bethany," he finally said, turning back to face me. His expression was serious, but his eyes gleamed with profound professional respect. "I have represented ruthless billionaires. I have sat in boardrooms with men who would sell their own grandmothers for a slight bump in their quarterly profit margins. But I have never seen anyone engineer a psychological trap quite as devastating as this one. You are allowing them to finance their own ultimate destruction, using the very arrogance they have always wielded against you as a weapon." I nodded slowly, picking up my tablet to verify the transaction had fully processed. The bank confirmed the $25,000 had been successfully routed to the resort and the airline. The trap was officially set, and the bait was currently resting right in front of them. My father would receive a notification from his booking agent within the next few minutes, confirming that his prestigious corporate card had miraculously started working again. He would immediately assume that his legal intimidation tactics had successfully broken my spirit. "He is going to call you Harrison," warned, leaning against the polished oak table. "As soon as he sees that the money went through, he is going to want to gloat. He will try to exert his dominance one last time before he leaves for the airport to prove to himself that he has completely subjugated you." "Let him call," I replied, my voice devoid of any fear or anxiety. "Let him gloat all he wants. Every arrogant word he speaks will only solidify his false sense of absolute security. He needs to feel completely invincible when he walks through the airport terminal. If he feels even a single ounce of doubt, he might decide to stay in Boston. We need him completely blinded by his own towering ego." I closed my briefcase and snapped the heavy brass lock shut. The sharp metallic click echoed loudly in the quiet conference room. I looked at Harrison, who was already gathering his legal pads. The paperwork for the foreclosure was already drafted and waiting in my secure files. We just needed the precise window of opportunity. The trap was set perfectly. I smiled broadly and then confidently walked out. I walked out of the towering glass and steel skyscraper into the crisp Boston evening, feeling an overwhelming sense of clarity. The bitter wind whipped through the city streets, but I did not feel the cold at all. I had just orchestrated the most critical phase of my entire plan. Harrison had fully understood the psychological mechanics of the trap, and now all we had to do was wait for my family to take the bait. I flagged down a taxi and headed straight back to my own downtown office building. The sun had completely set by the time I arrived, casting the city in a brilliant display of artificial light. I sat down at my heavy mahogany desk and opened my secure laptop. I needed to verify that the temporary authorization had functioned exactly as intended. I logged into the holding company portal and checked the primary corporate ledger. The $25,000 charge from the Hawaiian resort had fully cleared. A second charge from an elite luxury airline had also processed, confirming their first-class tickets were successfully booked. The financial breadcrumbs had been dropped. I closed the portal and leaned back in my leather chair. The silence of the empty office suite was incredibly soothing. Now the ball was entirely in their court. They had to wake up the next morning, see the cleared transactions, and convince themselves that they had won the war. The following morning unfolded exactly according to my calculated predictions. I arrived at my office early, brewing a fresh pot of Earl Grey tea and organizing the final foreclosure documents on my desk. At precisely 9 in the morning, my phone vibrated against the polished wood. the family group chat, which had been dead since my frozen card declaration, suddenly sprang back to life. I picked up the device and unlocked the screen. The first message was from my father, Richard. It was a photograph of a printed boarding pass resting on top of a steering wheel bearing the recognizable logo of his luxury sedan. The text below the image read simply that the legal system always favors the righteous. He actually believed his sleazy lawyer had terrified me into unlocking the accounts overnight. He believed the fraudulent court injunction had successfully brought the rebellious bookkeeper back to her knees. His massive ego completely prevented him from considering any other possibility. He did not question why only $25,000 had gone through. He only cared that his immediate demand had been met. 10 minutes later, my mother Diane chimed into the group chat. She sent a carefully curated selfie of her and Chelsea standing in the grand foyer of the Boston estate. They were surrounded by a massive mountain of designer luggage. Diane looked immaculate in a cashmere travel set and oversized sunglasses. Chelsea was wearing a brand new resort collection outfit that she had undoubtedly charged to the corporate account before I initiated the total lockdown. Diane typed a sickly sweet message stating how relieved she was that everyone had finally come to their senses. She added that family harmony was the most important thing in the world, and that she hoped I would spend the week reflecting on my recent erratic behavior. She was laying the groundwork to rewrite the narrative. In her mind, the temporary crisis was averted, and she could go back to pretending I was just a difficult child who occasionally needed to be disciplined. I did not respond to any of their messages. I just watched the notifications roll in. I could picture the chaotic scene. They were entirely oblivious to the fact that they were packing their bags and walking out of that house for the absolute last time. The heavy iron gates of the estate would soon close behind them, permanently sealing their fate. By noon, the messages shifted in tone from subtle passive-aggressive jabs to blatant, unrestrained gloating. They had successfully navigated the airport security checkpoints and settled into the exclusive first-class lounge at the international terminal. The photographs started arriving in rapid succession. Jason sent a picture of himself holding a crystal flute of complimentary champagne, leaning back in a plush leather lounge chair. His feet were propped up on a glass table displaying a pair of incredibly expensive designer sneakers. The caption below his photograph was short and dripping with pure arrogance. Aloha from the winners. He actually thought he had intimidated me into submission when he pounded on my door. He convinced himself that my threat to involve the federal authorities was just a bluff, because in his mind I was too weak to ever follow through. He believed the money flowing back into the account was proof of his dominance. Then came a message from my sister Chelsea. She sent a close-up selfie showing off her massive diamond engagement ring while holding a glossy travel brochure for the Hawaiian resort. She made sure to angle the camera so the exclusive first-class lounge branding was perfectly visible in the background. Her text message was vicious and incredibly precise. Next time, know your place, bookkeeper. I sat in my quiet, high-rise office reading their cruel messages one by one. I took a slow sip of my warm Earl Grey tea. Letting the aromatic flavor settle on my tongue, I did not feel a single ounce of anger. Their mocking selfies and arrogant texts did not sting the way they would have just a few weeks ago. Instead, their messages served as the ultimate confirmation that my psychological strategy had worked flawlessly. They were completely consumed by their own perceived victory. They were so busy celebrating my supposed defeat that they did not bother to check the balances on their personal checking accounts. They did not notice that the primary corporate ledger was still entirely locked down outside of that single $25,000 authorization. They were blinded by the champagne, the first-class luxury, and their own staggering sense of entitlement. I set my phone down on the desk, leaving the group chat open so I could monitor their progress. I shifted my attention to the large computer monitor on my left. I had pulled up the live commercial flight tracking radar. I entered their specific flight number. I closely watched as the small digital airplane icon slowly moved away from the terminal gate. They were officially boarding the massive aircraft right on schedule. In less than 45 minutes, They would be soaring high above the clouds, entirely disconnected from the mainland. They would have absolutely no cellular service and absolutely no wireless internet access for the entire duration of the long 10-hour flight over the vast Pacific Ocean. They would be completely trapped, unable to interfere with the reality unfolding back home. I moved my right hand over the massive stack of legal documents resting on the corner of my mahogany desk. These were the finalized legal foreclosure papers for the Boston estate. The documents were fully prepared, legally verified, and completely ready for immediate execution. My index finger hovered gently over the thick, crisp pages. The heavy brass locks of my leather briefcase sat wide open nearby. Everything felt perfectly aligned, exactly as I had meticulously planned it. The trap had been baited, and the arrogant prey had eagerly swallowed it whole. I took one last sip of my warm tea and smiled as I reached for the phone. I watched the tiny digital airplane icon on my computer monitor cross the invisible threshold, separating coastal radar systems from the vast open expanse of the Pacific Ocean. They were officially in the dead zone. For the next 8 hours, they would have absolutely no way to send or receive information. I picked up my desk phone and dialed Harrison. I told him it was time. He replied that he was already in the lobby. I gathered the stack of foreclosure documents from my desk, placing them carefully into my leather briefcase. The brass locks snapped shut with a heavy, definitive sound. I put on my winter coat and took the elevator down to the ground floor. Harrison was waiting by the revolving doors. He gave me a sharp, confirming nod as we walked out into the freezing Boston air. We climbed into the back of his waiting town car. The driver pulled away from the curb, merging into the late afternoon traffic. The ride to the suburbs was quiet. I looked out the tinted windows, watching the city skyline fade into the distance. This was the same route I had driven on Thanksgiving night, with tears stinging my eyes. Today I felt nothing but a profound sense of purpose. Harrison reviewed the legal paperwork one last time, ensuring every signature was perfect. The state laws regarding commercial foreclosure on cross-collateralized assets were specific, but we followed them to the absolute letter. The holding company was merely repossessing a defaulted asset. We turned onto the manicured roads of the affluent neighborhood. The massive oak trees were stripped bare by the winter wind. The driver slowed down as we approached the familiar wrought iron gates of the Winters estate. There were 2 vehicles already parked along the stone perimeter wall: a commercial locksmith van and a sleek sedan belonging to my real estate agent. We stepped out of the car, and the cold bit at my cheeks. The locksmith, a burly man named Frank, was unloading heavy toolboxes. The real estate agent, a sharp woman named Sarah, stood waiting by the pedestrian entrance holding a clipboard. I had hired Sarah specifically for her highly aggressive reputation in the luxury market. I introduced Harrison to the team and handed Sarah a copy of the finalized foreclosure execution order. She reviewed the documents quickly and smiled broadly. She knew a flawless corporate takeover when she saw one. I walked up to the iron gates. They were securely shut. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the old tarnished brass key I had carried since I was a teenager. I slid it into the lock and turned it. The heavy metal mechanism clicked open with a harsh grinding sound. I pushed the gates apart and led my team up the long, sweeping cobblestone driveway. The historic estate loomed ahead of us, looking grand and imposing against the gray winter sky. We reached the massive double front doors. I unlocked the primary deadbolt and pushed the heavy wooden door open. The house was completely silent. The air inside felt stale, holding the lingering scent of my mother and her floral perfume. I stood in the grand foyer, taking in the sweeping mahogany staircase and the massive crystal chandelier hanging overhead. This house had always been a fortress designed to keep the world out and trap me inside a cycle of inadequacy. Frank the locksmith went to work. He dropped his tool bag on the marble floor and began rapidly unscrewing the brass hardware from the front door. Sarah walked through the formal living room, taking detailed notes on her clipboard, evaluating the vast property for immediate liquidation. I walked slowly through the quiet rooms on the first floor. I walked directly into the formal dining room where just a few weeks ago my father had tapped his crystal glass and told me I was not part of the family. The long wooden table was bare now, stripped of its fine china and expensive silver flatware. I felt an incredible sense of closure standing in that empty room. The ghosts of their mocking laughter were completely gone, replaced by the sharp mechanical sounds of the locksmith drilling out the old deadbolts. Harrison walked into the dining room, his firm footsteps echoing. He handed me a clipboard with the final execution log. He told me the property was officially secured. Every exterior lock had been changed. The electronic garage codes were wiped clean. The internal security system was transferred directly to my personal phone. I signed the final line of the execution log, handing the clipboard back to Harrison. We walked back out into the freezing air. Frank was finishing the installation of the new high-security deadbolt on the front door. I handed him a set of heavy steel padlocks and a thick metal chain I had purchased earlier that morning. We walked down the cobblestone driveway together toward the main entrance. I watched as Frank wrapped the thick steel chain tightly around the intricate ironwork of the massive gates, securing them firmly together with the heavy padlocks. He handed me the only two keys that existed for those specific locks. I slipped them into my pocket. Sarah pulled a large duty plastic sign from the trunk of her car. She walked over to the exact center of the chained gates and secured the sign directly to the iron bars using thick plastic ties. I stood back and looked at the bold black lettering printed against the bright white background. The sign was absolutely impossible to miss. It read Property of C.W. Holdings, LLC. No trespassing. Violators will be prosecuted. The Winters family estate was officially gone forever. It was no longer a childhood home. It was simply a repossessed financial asset waiting to be liquidated to satisfy a massive corporate debt. I stood in the driveway for a long, quiet moment, watching the bitter winter wind rattle the plastic sign against the heavy iron gates. The absolute finality of the moment washed over me. I turned around and got back into the waiting town car with Harrison. The driver pulled away, leaving the padlocked estate fading quickly into the distance. 5,000 miles away on the other side of the world, a massive commercial airliner was beginning its final descent through the warm tropical clouds. The vibrant green islands of Hawaii stretched out beautifully below the aircraft, surrounded by the sparkling blue waters of the Pacific Ocean. Inside the luxurious first-class cabin, my family was stirring awake from their comfortable flight. My father, Richard, stretched his legs and confidently adjusted his gold watch, fully anticipating the incredible luxury that awaited him on the ground. My mother, Diane, carefully reapplied her flawless makeup, preparing to step off the plane, looking like high society royalty. My sister, Chelsea, eagerly powered on her phone, desperate to check her social media notifications, and loudly bragged to her wealthy friends about her arrival in an exclusive tropical paradise. My brother Jason grabbed his designer carry-on bag, completely oblivious to the harsh, unyielding reality waiting for him back on the mainland. They touched down on the sun-baked tarmac, completely consumed by their own arrogant triumph. They smiled and laughed joyously as they walked off the plane, breathing in the warm, tropical air, deeply convinced that they had successfully beaten me into submission with their fraudulent lawsuit. They were eagerly stepping into a 5-star luxury resort, completely blissful and entirely oblivious to the devastating truth. The beautiful Boston estate they had left behind no longer belonged to them. They were entirely homeless. I dialed the direct line for the private security firm I had contracted earlier in the week. I instructed them to initiate round-the-clock surveillance on the padlocked gates of the estate, ensuring absolutely no one could tamper with the heavy steel chains we had just installed. The dispatcher confirmed my request with professional efficiency, and I hung up the receiver. I leaned back in my leather office chair, letting the profound silence of my workspace wash over me. The hardest physical labor of my strategy was officially complete. The property was secured, the financial accounts were frozen, and my family was settling into the resort still completely unaware of what had happened in Boston. All I had to do now was wait for the inevitable collision between their towering arrogance and their new devastating reality. For the next 3 days, Boston was remarkably quiet. The estate remained secured behind the new chains and locks. The corporate accounts remained frozen. The security company sent me regular reports confirming that no one had attempted to enter the property. Meanwhile, 5,000 miles away, my family was preparing one final performance. Cameron and his parents were already in Hawaii waiting for Richard, Diane, and Chelsea to explain the financial records I had presented at the country club. Instead of admitting the truth, my parents decided to overwhelm them with luxury. They believed that if they spent enough money, booked enough private experiences, and behaved like wealthy socialites, Cameron's family would dismiss the evidence as nothing more than the work of a jealous and unstable daughter. It was the same strategy they had used for years. Replace uncomfortable facts with appearances. Replace accountability with extravagance. Replace the truth with a sufficiently expensive lie. But this time, every account supporting that lie belonged to me. I knew they would eventually attempt one dramatic purchase too large to hide or explain. So I waited in Boston while they built the stage for their own public collapse. 3 days later, the warm tropical breeze swept across the pristine white sands of the Aloha Resort and Spa. My family was 5,000 miles away from the freezing Boston winter, completely oblivious to the legal reality I had just cemented. In their minds, they had successfully weathered a minor storm. They had convinced themselves that the temporary freeze on the accounts was just a glitch or a brief temper tantrum from their deeply ungrateful daughter. To celebrate their supposed victory and to aggressively repair the social damage I had inflicted at the country club, Diane and Richard orchestrated the most desperate and expensive theatrical performance of their entire lives. Cameron and his parents had arrived on the island first, and my family followed them there, desperate to restore their trust and prevent the wedding from collapsing. Diane likely spun an incredibly elaborate web of lies, claiming the financial documents I presented were nothing more than the malicious fabrications of a deeply disturbed sibling. She framed this lavish getaway as a grand gesture of goodwill meant to soothe the tensions and prove beyond any shadow of a doubt that the Winters family was exactly as wealthy and stable as they had always claimed to be. They spared absolutely no expense to maintain this fragile illusion. They booked a private, secluded stretch of the resort beach for an incredibly opulent luau dinner. The cost for this single evening of entertainment was a staggering $10,000. It was an astronomical sum, but in their minds it was a necessary investment to secure Chelsea and her marriage to a high society heir. The evening air was thick with the scent of roasted pork hibiscus flowers and salty ocean mist. The private beach was illuminated by dozens of flickering tiki torches, casting a warm golden glow across the sand. A traditional Hawaiian music ensemble played soft melodic tunes on acoustic guitars and ukuleles in the background. Fire dancers performed spectacular synchronized routines, their flaming batons drawing wide-eyed gasps from the other resort guests, who watched the boastful display from a respectful distance. The entire resort was acutely aware of the massive private party happening on the sand. At the center of it all sat my father, Richard, holding court like a billionaire king. He was dressed in a crisp white linen shirt and expensive tailored trousers, swirling a glass of top-shelf bourbon. He spoke loudly and confidently, dominating the conversation at the long, exquisitely decorated dining table. He regaled Cameron and his father with exaggerated stories of his corporate triumphs and international business conquests. He laughed boisterously at his own jokes, projecting the image of a man completely unbothered by financial concerns. He was leaning heavily into his role, desperate to erase the lingering doubts I had planted deep inside of his mind just a few days prior. Diane sat elegantly beside Cameron and his mother, pouring expensive imported wine and offering compliment after compliment. She wore a stunning, flowing resort gown that she had undoubtedly charged to the corporate card before I initiated the total lockdown. She smiled her perfect, practiced smile, deflecting any serious conversation with superficial charm and grace. She was working tirelessly to charm her future, in-laws ensuring they felt completely pampered and deeply respected. Chelsea sat exceptionally close to Cameron, her hand resting possessively on his arm. She was wearing her massive diamond engagement ring, making sure it caught the light from the tiki torches every time she reached for her crystal water glass. Cameron sat stiffly in his chair, his body language polite but noticeably guarded. He had agreed to come on this trip, but the tension in his shoulders revealed that he was still harboring deep suspicions. He was a smart man, and the seeds of doubt I had sown were firmly rooted in his mind. He was watching their extravagant display of wealth with a critical, analytical eye, waiting for a single crack in their flawless facade. Jason sat at the far end of the table, taking full advantage of the unlimited open bar. He ordered premium cocktail after premium cocktail, laughing loudly and flirting with the waitstaff. He was completely oblivious to the delicate social maneuvering happening at the other end of the table. He simply viewed this trip as another free luxury vacation funded by the endless family bank account. He chewed on expensive roasted meats and toasted to his own fantastic luck, unaware that he was sitting on a ticking time bomb. The private luau stretched on for hours, a magnificent feast of excess and desperation. The waitstaff brought out platter after platter of incredible food. There was slow-roasted pork, fresh-caught fish glazed with sweet macadamia nut sauce, and massive bowls of tropical fruit. The family ate and drank with greedy enthusiasm, celebrating their successful manipulation of the billionaire guests. They truly believed they had won. They thought their sheer financial force and aggressive hospitality had successfully smoothed over the turbulent waters I had stirred up in Boston. I sat in my quiet apartment, 5,000 miles away, looking at the digital clock on my kitchen wall. I could vividly picture the scene unfolding under the tropical night sky. The fire dancers were taking their final bows. The gentle sound of the ocean waves crashing against the shore provided a soothing backdrop to the end of their extravagant feast. Richard leaned back in his plush-cushioned chair, patting his stomach with profound satisfaction. He looked across the table at Cameron and his parents, offering them a wide, confident grin. He told them how thrilled he was that they could join his family in paradise, and how much he looked forward to officially welcoming Cameron into the winter's fold. He spoke with the absolute certainty of a man who believed he held the entire world in the palm of his hand. The table was cleared of the empty platters and half-finished wine glasses. The conversation shifted to a quiet, comfortable murmur as everyone relaxed into the warm, tropical evening. Diane smiled triumphantly at Chelsea, communicating silently that their desperate plan had worked perfectly. They had successfully proven their incredible wealth and completely dismissed my factual warnings as the ramblings of a jealous sibling. Then a tall, impeccably dressed waiter in a crisp white uniform stepped out from the shadows of the nearby palm trees. He walked purposefully across the soft white sand, moving directly toward the head of the long dining table. In his right hand, he carried a gleaming, polished silver platter. Resting perfectly in the center of that silver platter was a thick black leather folder holding the massive $10,000 check for the luau dinner. Richard puffed out his chest, preparing for his grand finale. He reached into the inner pocket of his tailored jacket and pulled out his heavy gold corporate credit card. He wanted Cameron and his father to see him casually drop $10,000 without a second thought. He placed the card onto the silver platter with a loud, definitive snap. He waved the waiter away with an arrogant flick of his wrist, telling him to add a generous 20% gratuity for the excellent service. The waiter nodded politely and turned back toward the main resort building to process the payment. Richard smiled at Cameron, raising his bourbon glass to propose a final toast to their united future together. He had absolutely no idea that his entire fragile world was about to come crashing violently down. The warm breeze rustled the palm leaves as Richard raised his glass to complete his toast. Then the waiter returned. He stood by Richard. He approached the head of the table with a stiff, uncomfortable expression. "Sir, I am incredibly sorry, but the payment did not process," the waiter said, holding the platter forward. The bank returned a code indicating the card was declined. Richard let out an arrogant laugh, shaking his head. He looked around, ensuring Cameron saw how unbothered he was. It is a fraud protection trigger, Richard declared, waving his hand. My bank is cautious when they see a large charge originating from an island. It happens all the time when you have a credit limit as high as mine. Just run this one instead. Richard reached into his tailored jacket pocket and pulled out his personal platinum credit card. He dropped it onto the silver platter with a heavy thud. He told the waiter to run it immediately today. The waiter nodded nervously and walked back. The conversation at the table resumed, but the atmosphere had shifted. Diane tried to fill the silence by asking Cameron about travel destinations, but her voice was tight and strained. Chelsea gripped her wineglass, her knuckles turning white. Less than 5 minutes later, the waiter returned. This time, he was accompanied by the general manager of the resort. The manager was a tall, imposing man with a deeply serious expression. He did not look like a man preparing to apologize for a banking error. He stopped at the edge of the table and looked directly down at my father. Mr. Winters. The general manager began, his voice carrying across the quiet, private beach. I am afraid we have a very serious problem. The second credit card you provided was also completely declined. In fact, our billing department just received an automated alert from your primary financial institution. All of the accounts associated with your name have been permanently frozen due to severe delinquency. The entire table fell into a deadly, humiliating silence. The sound of the ocean waves crashing against the sand suddenly seemed incredibly loud. Richard felt the blood drain completely from his face. He stared at the resort manager, his mouth opening and closing in sheer disbelief. That is absolutely impossible, Richard sputtered, his voice cracking. Do you have any idea who I am? There are millions of dollars in those accounts. Run the cards again. Run them until they go through. Chelsea jumped up from her chair, her face flushed with panic. She reached into her designer handbag and pulled out her own corporate card. Here, she said frantically, shoving it toward the manager. Just use mine. Put the entire dinner on this one right now. The manager did not even reach for her card. He shook his head slowly, looking at her with a mixture of pity and profound irritation. Ma'am, we already tried to process the authorization for your luxury suites earlier this evening. Every single card registered to your family profile has been completely blocked by the issuing bank. Cameron and his parents watched the spectacular scene unfold with wide, horrified eyes. They were sitting at a $10,000 dinner table watching their hosts fail to produce a single functioning line of credit. The opulent facade was ripping apart at the seams right in front of them. The general manager was not finished. He stood taller, addressing the entire group. Because we cannot secure payment for this evening, and because your initial deposit was retroactively rejected by the holding company, we have been forced to take immediate action. We have officially locked you out of your luxury suites. Your belongings have been moved to the front desk. You will not be permitted back into the rooms until this massive outstanding balance is settled in full in cash. Diane let out a sharp, horrified shriek. She covered her face with her hands, trembling violently in her chair. Chelsea looked like she was about to vomit. She turned to Cameron, desperate to offer an excuse, but he had physically recoiled from her, pulling his chair back from the table. Richard was sweating profusely. Large beads of perspiration rolled down his forehead, soaking into the collar of his expensive linen shirt. He was trapped. He was utterly humiliated in front of the one family he desperately needed to impress. His towering ego could not handle the crushing weight of the public embarrassment. He needed a scapegoat. He needed someone to blame for this catastrophic failure so he could save face in front of the billionaires sitting across from him. He pulled his mobile phone from his pocket. His hands were shaking so violently he almost dropped the device onto the sand. I am calling my accountant right now, Richard announced loudly, trying to project an aura of furious authority. My daughter handles the books. She must have messed up the security protocols when she transferred the funds. I am going to have her fix this ridiculous error right this second. He navigated to my contact name and pressed the call button. He did not just put the phone to his ear. He placed the device directly in the center of the dining table and pressed the speakerphone button. He wanted Cameron and his parents to hear him command his disobedient employee. He wanted them to hear him fix the problem with ruthless corporate efficiency. I was sitting in my quiet apartment in Boston when the phone began to ring. I looked at the caller identification. The trap had closed. I let it ring 3 times, letting his anxiety build to an absolute boiling point. Then I reached out and answered the call. "Bethany!" Richard screamed into the phone. His voice echoed wildly out of the small speaker carrying across the silent Hawaiian beach. "What the hell did you do to the accounts? I am sitting here with Cameron and his family, and every single card is declining. The resort just locked us out of our suites. Unfreeze the money this instant. Fix this embarrassing bank error right now, or I will destroy your career." I sat perfectly still in my kitchen. I took a slow, steady breath. I pictured him sweating, surrounded by the ruins of his empire. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with chilling clarity, ensuring everyone heard what I had to say. "There is no error, Richard. You mocked me for being a bookkeeper. You laughed in my face and told me to stay home with the dogs. So I kept the books. I kept the books exactly the way I wanted to keep them. I let you take this vacation so I could finalize the foreclosure on your house. The estate is gone, Richard. The real estate agent and the locksmith came today. We changed every single lock on the property. We chained the heavy iron gates shut. The cars have been completely repossessed by the holding company. The import business is officially dissolved and rebranded under my name. You have absolutely no money, you have no credit, you have nowhere to live." I paused, letting reality sink in. I could hear Diane sobbing uncontrollably in the background. I could hear Chelsea gasping for air. "You told me the vacation was only for family," I concluded coldly. "Well, now you have nothing but each other. Enjoy the rest of your trip." I reached out and pressed the button ending the call. The deafening silence on the private beach was broken by the sharp scrape of a wooden chair against the sand. Cameron and his father stood up slowly. The older billionaire looked at Richard with an expression of pure revulsion. He did not yell or raise his voice. He simply adjusted his tailored jacket and looked down at my father with the cold detachment of a man surveying a crushed insect. "The wedding is permanently cancelled," he announced, his voice carrying a chilling finality. "Cameron, do not ever associate with these fraudulent parasites again. We are leaving immediately." Cameron did not look at Chelsea as he turned and followed his parents away from the dining table. Chelsea let out a desperate wail, but her cries went ignored. They walked toward the main resort building, disappearing into the tropical shadows. My family was left completely alone on the white sand, surrounded by a feast they could not pay for. They had 0 credit cards, 0 cash, and no dignity. The resort manager firmly escorted them off the private beach and ordered them to gather their belongings. They were stranded in paradise. The brutal reality of their situation crashed down upon them. They sat huddled in the grand lobby of the hotel, their designer luggage piled haphazardly around their feet. When Richard tried to rebook their return flights, he discovered I had already canceled the original first-class tickets. They were trapped 5,000 miles away from the mainland, without a single cent. The sheer desperation set in as the night grew darker. The mighty Richard Winters was forced to pull out his mobile phone and beg. He called a distant cousin he had not spoken to in a decade, swallowing his pride to plead for a miserable loan. He begged for enough money to purchase 4 budget economy class tickets on a red-eye flight back to Massachusetts. The cousin agreed, but the humiliation completely shattered my father and his fragile ego. They spent the night sleeping on the uncomfortable benches of the Honolulu airport terminal, surrounded by people they had always considered vastly inferior to themselves. The miserable flight back to the mainland took 14 agonizing hours. They were crammed into tiny middle seats near the rear lavatories, forced to endure the cramped conditions without complimentary champagne or hot towels. When they finally landed in Boston, they stepped out of the airport into a torrential downpour of freezing winter rain. The weather was a poetic reflection of the exact conditions I faced when I walked out of Thanksgiving dinner. Shivering and completely exhausted, they pooled their remaining borrowed cash to hire a yellow taxi. They rode in total silence, expecting to find refuge inside the massive historic mansion. The taxi pulled up to the wrought iron gates and stopped. Richard stepped out into the freezing rain and froze. The heavy steel chains and thick brass padlocks gleamed under the streetlights. Secured perfectly in the center of the imposing gates was the bright white plastic sign declaring the property officially belonged to CW Holdings, LLC. The estate was completely locked down. They had absolutely nowhere to go. They were entirely homeless, standing in the rain with their ruined designer clothes clinging to their shivering bodies. I stood on the expansive glass balcony of my new luxury penthouse, perfectly insulated from the bitter cold. I held a glass of vintage wine looking out over the illuminated Boston city skyline. I had spent the past week restructuring the logistics company, cleaning out the toxic rot my father left behind. My mobile phone vibrated softly against the glass table beside me. The screen lit up, displaying an incoming call from Diane. She was undoubtedly standing outside those chained gates, soaking wet and completely desperate. She was calling to beg for a second chance to manipulate me. I picked up the device and stared at her name. I felt no anger and no sorrow. I calmly pressed the block button and permanently deleted her contact information from my life. I set my empty wineglass down and grabbed the handle of my designer suitcase. I walked out of the penthouse and stepped into the private town car waiting for me. The driver smiled and asked if I was ready to head to the airport. I nodded, looking out the window as we drove away. I was boarding an overnight flight for a luxurious month-long vacation in Paris. I was finally completely and blissfully alone. Looking back on everything, I realized the most profound lesson was not about money or corporate leverage. It was about recognizing my own inherent worth. For over 3 decades, I believed that if I just worked hard enough and fixed enough of their mistakes, my family would finally love me. I thought my financial protection would eventually earn their respect. But toxic relationships do not operate on a currency of gratitude. When people are committed to seeing you as less than nothing, will ever be enough to change their minds. The hardest truth I had to accept was that family is not defined by blood or shared history. True family does not exploit your vulnerabilities while secretly feeding off your success. They do not demand your loyalty while offering cruelty in return. Sometimes the people who are supposed to protect you are the exact people you need to protect yourself from. Walking away from them was the most liberating decision of my entire life. I learned that you cannot heal a toxic dynamic by simply absorbing the damage. Sometimes the only way to win a rigged game is to completely flip the board and walk out of the room. You have to be willing to create your own closure. If you are pouring your heart into people who only see you as a resource, please know that you deserve better. Your worth is not determined by those who are blind to it. Have you ever had to draw a hard line and walk away from toxic relatives to protect your peace? Share your stories in the comments below. If my journey resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe to my channel for more stories about finding your strength. Thank you for listening, and remember that walking away from toxicity is your greatest victory.